Good evening, everyone. My name is Carol Homden, and I'm the Chief Executive of Coram. And 270 years ago today, Thomas Coram died, leaving behind a world that he had helped to change for the better for children, and this charity, which is his enduring legacy. In today's webinar, we're going to explore his life and legacy through the vital and important portrait painted of him in 1740, which hangs today in the Foundling Museum, through his words and those words of his contemporaries about him. And we are joined today by Dame Gilliam Wagner, Coram's biographer, and the first woman chairman of this organisation, and by Carol Harris, our social historian, and Mariam, one of our young campaigners who is working with Coram today to change the world still further for young people in and leaving care. So this is a webinar format in which you will need to adjust your own sound. You will not be able to see your fellow attendees, but welcome to the several hundred people who are gathered tonight. And this event is being recorded. We would be delighted if you would like to raise questions for the latter period of this webinar, which will last just over an hour. And please do use the Q&A box in order to do so. And I will give a few further pointers on that later. So I hope very much that you're going to enjoy Thomas Coram Life and Legacy. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Dame Gillian, followed by Carol Harris, before I return to speak with you later. Over to you, Gillian.
Thomas Coram is my hero, so I'm always delighted to have an occasion to talk about him, and especially around this portrait of his sitting and with his red coat on. What makes this painting so remarkable, it was painted at a time when portraits were usually of the wealthy, the aristocracy, and the movers and shakers. But Coram, he might have been a mover and shaker, but he was neither wealthy nor titled. And Hogarth painted this great portrait of him in the grand manner in 1740 and gave it to the Foundling Hospital. I think that Coram looks slightly uncomfortable in this picture. He would rather be up and doing things. It is not his style, really. Hogarth may have decided to paint him in the grand manner like this, while he watched him read out the charter announcing the creation of the Foundling Hospital at a great meeting at Somerset House. There were dukes and earls and the cream of the aristocracy, and there was Thomas Coram, short and stout, the only person not wearing a wig and dressed in his well-worn red coat, but he dominated the proceedings. I believe it was at that moment that Hogarth decided to paint Coram in the grand manner, surrounded by references to his life, which we will look at later. Hogarth wrote that Coram's portrait gave him the most pleasure to paint and was the one he most wanted to excel in. Coram is shown holding the charter in one hand and a pair of gloves in the other, but not wearing them. Gloves were fashionable and expensive and worn by gentlemen. His buckled shoes only just touching the ground, and his tricorn hat at his side. His waistcoat is untidily unbuttoned and looks like a man in a hurry, and his plentiful white hair was in place of the wig, which he would not have been able to afford. Can we have the next slide? Coram was born in Lyme Regis in 1668, and at the time of his birth, Lyme Regis was a busy port and a harbour full of ships and merchant and naval, and the town life centred round the port. Coram did not have an easy childhood. His baby brother William died in infancy, and his mother died when he was only 3. His father sent him to sea when he was only 11, and he always regretted that his education had been curtailed. 5 years later, his father recalled him when he was 16 and apprenticed him to a shipwright. His first paid job was in Liverpool to oversee army supplies and naval goods that were being shipped to Ireland in 1788. He was so successful and was respected by everyone that he was given the freedom of Liverpool, which meant he could work there. But more importantly, he also came to the notice of William Hunt, a merchant who would change his life forever. Hunt was very important in Coram's life, and he appointed him as his factor and instructed him to set up a boat building business in Boston. Boston was a British colony at the time, and after 3 years working in Boston, Coram thought he had more room and space and relocated his shipbuilding business to Dighton near Taunton, about 40 miles southeast of Boston. Dighton was a small, strictly puritanical community, and Coram, hardworking, successful, and wanting to build an Anglican church in the town, did not get on with his neighbours, who resented his success and didn't like his Anglican ways, and neither did they approve of his wish to educate the native Indians. In the meantime, he had got married to Eunice Waite, a Boston girl, in 1700, and he brought her to Dighton, where he had built a house. They had no children. But matters came to a head when Coram's shipyard, with 2 ships on the stocks, were vandalized and wrecked. Coram, heavily in debt, was forced to return to England in 1704 with his wife. Coram had always hoped that he'd be able to return to America, but it was not to be. There was much that he admired, including the important role played by women in the young colony, and he brought with him unparalleled knowledge of the opportunities that existed for settling the unpopulated lands of North America with the unemployed soldiers and others seeking work. He gave unstinting advice to the Board of Trade and Plantations, and when he was asked for a grant for a pension, answer came there none. He became one of the trustees for the new colony of Georgia, but he retired when the other trustees would not agree to women being able to inherit the land, and there was no male heir. His plan for the colonization of Nova Scotia was almost complete when he became ill and when Queen Caroline died. So there was no chance of his plans being approved. And with that, Coram lost the last chance of his being able to return to America. Although Coram never saw his plans for Nova Scotia realized, it was in 1749 Lord Halifax led a successful expedition to Nova Scotia, and he relied entirely on the plans that Coram had set out in 1937. Coram was a convinced mercantilist and gave much time and thought to the ways of promoting and encouraging trade between Britain and America in the colonies. The Tar Act of 1704 was an example of how Coram intervened to get the Navy Office to import timber and tar from America rather than from Sweden. He intervened again in 1732 to stop the manufacture of hats in the colonies, forcing the colonists to buy manufactured hats in Britain. He refused any payment by way of reward from the Hatters Company, and they presented him with a hat for the remainder of his life. Coram had asked the Board of Trade and Plantations for a pension twice, and in recognition of all he had done, but there was never any response. However, the knowledge and experience he had gained inspired Coram to use the model of trade associations for his charity, and the Board of Governors holding its mission in trust. So that is, there is the hat that he was given. Whenever it wore out, he was given a new one, and many of his paintings is depicted with his hat on his head. And that is the house in the corner. That is the house he built in and it's still there. And the owners were very proud of the association they had with Coram.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Gillian. So I'm going to take over now and look a little bit more at the details in the portrait that relate to the Foundling Hospital. Here, of course, you can see the Royal Charter, and on his return to England in the early 1700s, Coram would have been familiar with the site that many others saw on the streets of London and other parts of the country, which was essentially of abandoned babies and children left by mothers who could not afford to look after them, for whom having a child outside marriage was a source of such terrible shame it would result in destitution and really being shunned by society. So it was a common sight, and for the most part the prevailing view of society at the time was that children were expendable, and that preventing the deaths of such abandoned babies was not as important as deterring women from what was termed wickedness, with a capital W, essentially having sex outside marriage. He was very much against this view, very much out of his time in his thinking. He believed that it was the humanitarian thing to do to save such children. He believed that they might be brought up instead to be good citizens for King George and the nation, which were essentially one and the same. He did have allies in this, and that he was involved in London in the Society for the Promotion of the Christian Gospel, Christian knowledge. Notable people like Reverend Thomas Bray, who was a friend of his and leader of the society, also interested in this issue and in establishing a foundling hospital. There were foundling hospitals elsewhere in Europe, but nothing like it at the time in this country. So Thomas Coram took up the cause, and he did it through petitions. So in the portraits, just under the Royal Charter image here, you will see rolls of paper, which are essentially the petitions signed by the great and the good and the wealthy and powerful of the time. Essentially, as a man, as Gillian has said, without any connections and without any status to speak of in society, it was a really difficult thing for him to get the necessary power and influence at the time in the way that things were done. And he did this at first not by asking the men themselves, but by asking their wives to sign a ladies' petition, and their influence was then brought to bear on their husbands. And the 21 ladies of quality and distinction were among them the Duchess of Somerset, Charlotte Finch, the Duke and Duchess, or the Duchess of Richmond, Sarah Cadogan. These 21 ladies were all members of the ladies of the bedchamber to Queen Caroline, so powerful and influential in an indirect sense, if you like. So he campaigned for 17 years with the ladies' petition and then with the petition of the gentlemen. He also gathered support and cash and signatures from the merchants of the burgeoning city of London at that time. And eventually in 1739, King George granted a royal charter that said the Foundling Hospital must be built. And this image here is the Duke of Somerset's house at the time. It's the modern version of Somerset House in the Strand. It's the same location, but it's a more recent building. It's the same place though. And Thomas Coram made a speech to the first president at that first meeting of the governors of the charity, and the charter was presented, and essentially it was off the ground. The charity was established. This is a couple of images here, one from the portrait by William Hogarth. You can see on the left is the seal of the Foundling Hospital, and this is the crest of the Foundling Hospital in a design for a ticket for a concert by Frederick Handel in aid of the Foundling Hospital. Hogarth had a long and quite a very, very heavy involvement with the Foundling Hospital. He and his wife fostered many children. Hogarth was one of the founding governors. And he, as well as the portrait, which he presented to the hospital, as you can see here, he designed various elements of the hospital's sort of artwork and stuff. So I think it's very Hogarth that we have here on this crest. No Latin or complicated sort of mottos for him. There's a baby and the word help, which really did sum up how Thomas Coram saw the situation he was trying to put right. The other two figures, Diana and Britannia, certainly speak as well to the kind of themes of the Foundling Hospital at the time. Sorry, next slide, please, David. Thank you. Books, education. On the portrait, you can see in the top left-hand corner, there's a rather splendid volume. He, as Gillian said, very much aware of his lack of education and he valued education and books enormously. This is, in this right-hand image here, a copy of the Book of Common Prayer. That was, as the inscription says, the gift of Arthur Onslow, Speaker of the House of Commons, to Thomas Coram, gentleman, in 1736. It was one of several books that were collected together by Thomas Coram. He often collected books and sent them out to various causes. And this particular book has Thomas's own handwriting. It's so wonderfully distinctive. Just at the bottom, underneath the rather lovely calligraphy, this very hurried, almost untidy script, very obviously Thomas, in which he's saying, I'm giving this particular copy of the prayer book for use in the Foundling Hospital chapel, and as I say, a very practical gift. He also gave books, sent them out to Harvard University, whose crest you can see here. They'd been established for quite a long time, but there was a fire in which all but one of their books was burned, so that was a very useful contribution. He sent books to establish the library in the Anglican Church he hoped would be built at some time in Taunton, the town he'd lived in America, where he had not got on with his neighbours. And he also sent books out with which to educate the Native Americans. Particularly, he was keen on the education of girls. He said, I think it is more material, education for girls, when they come to be mothers, will have the forming of their children's lives. If their mothers be good or bad, the children generally take after them, so that giving girls a virtuous education is a vast advantage to their posterity as well as to the public. He also was very keen that they were given an Anglican education with English books instead of being educated by the French Catholics who were out there too. This is something, if you in times when we can go and see the actual portrait, have a good look at this when you see it. In a corner, in the right-hand corner of the portrait, you can just make out, if you look here, there's a figure of a child. And this again is the Foundling Hospital. It's a child being held by a woman. It's remarkably subtle, especially for Hogarth, and it's actually meant to represent the figure of charity. More identifiably, of course, here is the Foundling Hospital. The initial building, initial premises in Hampton Garden, opened in 1741, were replaced soon by a rather large building in Bloomsbury, and where our current headquarters are today. This is the Foundling Hospital as it was in 1740s, and you can see the women queuing with their babies outside. It was quite a landmark building until 1926, when the charity moved away to Berkhamsted. It occupied that part of Bloomsbury, so you can still see signs of it. And next slide, please. So Thomas Coram died in 1751 at the age of 83. Somewhat predictably, he had fallen out with his fellow governors of the Foundling Hospital some years before, and as a result didn't have a great deal to do with the hospital in any formal sense after 1742. But in 1749, the governors and others decided to raise a pension for him and asked him if he would accept it. And typically he said, I have not wasted the little wealth of which I was formerly possessed in self-indulgent and vain expenses, and I'm not ashamed to confess this, that in my old age I am poor. So he was able to rent rooms near the Foundling Hospital and spend his last few years visiting the Foundling Hospital, as indeed he'd continued to do for baptisms, but also coming into the grounds and sitting with the children and, according to a contemporary report, bringing them gingerbread in his pockets. On the right here, you can see the stained glass window, which is in the church that was eventually built in Taunton in Massachusetts. There were several versions of it, but they did eventually become Anglicans, and you can see that to this day if you visit there. So it's certainly a fitting memorial to him. Today we're based on the Coram campus, which is a 9-acre site near to where, say, the original Foundling Hospital used to stand. I'll hand you back to Carol, though, to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol and Gillian. Yes, today we are still based on the same site. The Foundling Hospital building was originally on what is now the football pitches within Coram's fields. And you can see behind me, and indeed in your slide, today's frontage to the continuing Coram, with the statue unveiled to Thomas Coram in 1963, pride of place in front of the charity, which is the legacy of the Foundling Hospital in its original form between 1741 and 1954, when the name was changed, was that 27,000 children lived and were educated within its doors. Since that time, the charity named for Coram has continued to pioneer the welfare and rights of children. So still today, continuing the contemporary work in supporting infants who need care away from their birth family through fostering and adoption, supporting mothers who are themselves struggling to cope and who may be within care proceedings through our legal practice, advancing and championing young people in leaving care through advocacy and their rights, and trying to pioneer and develop and advance rights for children around the world through Coram International, which delivered its legal systems consultancy and research in 29 countries last year. So I think Thomas Coram would feel himself present, as our current chairman, Sir David Bell, often says. It often feels to me as if Thomas Coram might walk right in to our trustees meeting and be as curmudgeonly and as concerned as ever he was. And in the year 2018, the 350th anniversary of Thomas Coram's birth, we were proud to celebrate those achievements through the visit of Her Majesty the Queen to mark that important landmark. And here she is with Shyla, a young person supported by Coram, adding to the Christmas tree the image of Thomas Coram's coat. And David is now going to share with us a short video about the making of that coat by a most remarkable clothing producer who is a specialist in historic creations. And this shows you how Thomas Coram's coat may indeed have been made, and it now is still to be seen on the Coram campus. Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and also for the inspiration that led to the creation of that and to the miniature coat. We're going to just reflect now on the fact that Thomas Coram was a radical campaigner. Of that, there is no doubt. His views were at odds with the social mores of the time. And he would be, I believe, proud of the campaigning work that Coram continues to do in his name, and indeed that our young people continue to do on behalf of all of those who are in and leaving care. And in recent months, Coram has launched a new website called thecoramstory.org.uk, in which you can explore more about Thomas Coram's life and also the timeline of care. David, I believe we're going to just see the image of that so that you know where to go and to look for it. Yes, thank you. And you are able to follow up more around Thomas Coram by reading Gilliam's magnificent book, Thomas Coram, Gent, which is called that in tribute to Coram's own aspiration to be seen as a gentleman, and also perhaps to bring the Coram story alive to children by buying or having a copy of our publication for children, which is called Captain Coram, Champion for Children, which is also available on our website and was circulated through a crowdfunding appeal to all primary schools in the United Kingdom. So children should always know of the legacy that Thomas Coram had left to them. But really, the final word needs to go to Mariam, who, one of our young campaigners today, who is going to read for us the memorial to Thomas Coram from 1751. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you. Captain Thomas Coram, whose name will never want a monument so long as this hospital shall subside, was born in the year 1668, a man eminent in that most eminent virtue, the love of mankind, little attentive to his private fortune, and refusing many opportunities of increasing it. His time and thoughts were continually employed in endeavours to promote the public happiness, both in this kingdom and elsewhere, particularly in the colonies of North America, and his endeavours were many times crowned with the desired success. His unwearied solicitation for above 17 years together, which would have baffled the patience and industry of any man less ceaseless in doing good, and his application to persons of distinction of both sexes, obtained at length the character of the incorporation, bearing date the 17th October 1739, for the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted young children, by which many thousands of lives may be preserved to the public and employed in a frugal and honest course of industry. He died the 29th of March, 1751, in the 84th year of his age, poor in worldly estate, rich in good works, and was buried at his own desire in the vault underneath this chapel. At the east end, there are many of the governors and other gentlemen attending the funeral to do honour to his memory. Thy actions will show whether thou art sincere in the praises thou must bestow on him, and if thou hast virtue enough to commend his virtues, forget not to add also the imitation of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you. So which of us would have the privilege of having such words written about us? And the thing that we quote from Thomas Coram on the wall of Coram today is his famous words: "I believe everyone ought, in duty, to do any good they can." So with those few remarks, I now open the floor to people who would like to explore Thomas Coram's life and legacy with Gillian and Carol, myself and Mariam. And we do have a couple of questions that have been asked, which are perhaps straightforward to answer, Carol, whilst you get your fingers typing on the Q&A. Please do use that function. And Carol, the question was, where is his house?
Right. Yes, his house is in Water Street, Dighton, which is near Taunton in Massachusetts. So it's, you can look at it on Google Maps if you can't, as we can't go over there now. Yes, it's the whole area is the Coram Historic Boatyard section. So I think, Dame Gillian, you've been there, haven't you?
I have been there, and I've been in the house, and although it's been altered a bit from his day, the central oven is there with the bricks that were brought as ballast, and so there's a central oven, and the very steep staircase that he had to go up, that is original, and bits of it are still of the original. So it was very exciting, and the people who own it now were very proud and pleased to be in a house that Coram had built. So it was well cherished.
Yeah, I think
in my day.
Nothing quite like it, going to a location that someone you sort of, I do thoroughly recommend the biography. It's a fantastically good read, and you really get a sense of what it was like to live there all those years ago, I think, as well. So yeah, I've also seen on the questions about his plan for Nova Scotia. So I mean, essentially, it was for, as he said, a safe, free and civil government. He was very detailed in his ideas about what was needed in laying it out. He talked about they would need various types of equipment, they would need a forge, they would need some weapons to defend themselves, they would need bricks and tiles, etc., to build their houses. They would need pine boards for building huts, food for the cows and bulls. They would need 20 pairs of working oxen, 50 swine, 60 goats, all this sort of detailed stuff. He also had a list of 102 named settlers that he wanted to, he said, were willing to go over, essentially unemployed men, mainly carpenters. Very, very detailed. But again, this is all in your biography, isn't it, Gillian? So it's,
I think so, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's very assiduous in what needs to be done and detailing it all. He must have spent so much time and effort in putting it all together, not just writing it out, but actually recruiting people as well.
And he was so nearly there, so nearly had it.
Yes,
It was all ready to go when, I don't know which was first, he got ill or the Queen died, but both things stymied his plans. And I think he never went back to America. That was the last chance he had to go back to America, which he always longed to do.
He was campaigning hard and finding it difficult to tackle the views of the day, which was that children abandoned on the streets, really shouldn't be rescued. That was the sort of prevailing mores of the day. And yet he set about campaigning through recruiting the favour of women of quality and distinction. And we have a question about how did he become associated with them, since he was not a man of the court himself?
Well, I don't know how, I think he just did it. He did many things while he wasn't just thinking of the colonies, but he was also dealing in saltpeter and gunpowder. And he was somewhere near Guildford when he got on his horse and walked across to Petworth to meet the Duchess of Somerset. And he asked her to sign. How he made the connection, I don't know, but I just can imagine him going on horseback from somewhere near Guildford, where he had his gunpowder business, and arriving and knocking on the door of Petworth and being shown in and asking the Duchess to sign his, which she did. How he did it, I have no idea, except force of character.
I suspect he wouldn't go away until they'd seen him. That was part of it, wasn't it? He would turn up again and again. And yeah, there is also, I think it's worth mentioning, the fact that he had a very good reputation amongst some of the leading sort of people, the merchants particularly of the time, and the politicians. So he had a good reputation going before him, if you like. But yes, it wasn't an easy. It wasn't like he just turned up and they were pleased to see him. I think it took 17 years, and a lot of that was actually literally trying to get there to present his case. I think the other thing about the ladies particularly that always interests me is the fragility of their situation in the Georgian era. Women died in childbirth, and their jobs as ladies of quality and distinction was to produce heirs, and that was their role. They had no rights, they had no real formal power or status. They couldn't own their own property in the way we'd expect today. It was, some of them, I know, for example, the Duchess of Richmond was only 19, I think, when he got her signature on the petition. She'd already lost several children who died in infancy, and yeah, I can't help but think there was a certain element of his appeal that spoke to them as very young women. They knew what it was like to lose a child. They knew how hard it was to give a child up.
He certainly told it like it was.
Yeah.
And perhaps that was refreshing. And I think he's a classic case of, if you don't ask, you don't get. And if you keep asking, you may eventually get. So I think that there's some messages for us for the campaigning approach on issues that we still care about. There are a number of questions here which that Carol, another Carol, Carol Crook and Elaine and Hilary are asking and so on, which is that Coram lived somewhere near Leicester Square, and we believe in Leicester Street, but we don't know, I believe, the exact location. He was originally interred in the chapel on our current site, but now his tomb is in St Andrew's Church in Holborn, which is our nearby church, along with the pulpit and the font from the original building. And there's a question also about, well, was there any association with Great Ormond Street? Well, Great Ormond Street was a little later, and we often wonder whether this isn't really the quarter for children, because of the significant presence of the Foundling Hospital in it, because there is also, of course, now the Institute of Education nearby and the Institute for Child Health. And I gather, I think, Gillian, I'm right in saying that we don't actually know what the date of Thomas Coram's birth was. And
well, I think it must be that time, but there's no evidence of it. There wasn't any notification. I mean, his little brother, that his birth and his death are in the church records, but there's nothing about Coram. But we know just by looking at the different dates that must have been when he was born. But we haven't got any official sort of documentation of it.
Yes, I believe there's some discontinuity in the records in Lyme Regis, but I think it's Veronica who was sorry when she visited Lyme Regis not to find more of a presence for Thomas Coram. I believe that there were a number of children, Carol, named for Thomas Coram, Elaine transcribing the registers.
Yeah.
There were quite a number, weren't there?
Yes, in fact, the first two children christened on the first night that children were taken into the Foundling Hospital were called Thomas and Eunice, after Thomas and his wife Eunice. It was the thing at first to name the children who were all, as they were taken into the Foundling Hospital, they were rebaptized, or baptized, whether they had been or not wasn't counted. This was the idea, was it gave their mothers a fresh start in life, it gave the children a fresh start in life, and their identities, their original identities, such as details as they were sealed up in our famous billet books, so that only to be unsealed if the mother came to reclaim the child, which of course very rarely happened. So at first the children were named after the governors. This I think we could see the problems this might have caused somewhere down the line later on, at a time when there was no such thing as DNA or blood tests or proving paternity, and it was very much the stuff of popular fiction and stuff. Yes, you found that there were, not just with the foundlings in the Foundling Hospital, but the idea of a foundling having an aristocratic background and reclaiming their birthright. I don't think they'd really thought that through. So after a while, they changed the name. They changed into names that were really just very much more, well, eclectic, I suppose is a good word. Some of them are really good fun. Salisbury Brereton, that's a fantastic name. John Brownlow, one of our most famous sort of foundlings, who became Secretary of the Governors in the early 1800s. His name and probably his character is one of the characters named in Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens' book. Whether we know Charles Dickens knew John Brownlow very well and may have put that name in the book for that reason, but Brownlow is also the name of one of the streets nearby, and one of the trends in amongst the record books that we have are for children to be named after local streets, which is certainly how authors like to do things as well. So there's no risk of someone saying, how dare you name me after the villain in your novel.
Okay, I think Mariam wanted to come in, and Gillian, on this point about names. I mean, a name is quite an important attribute, and in those days certainly may have been quite an important gift. Mariam?
I just wanted to ask about the part where she mentioned that the documents would only be reopened if the mother reclaimed the child. I was just intrigued. Is that the reason why that's done today with the kids in the care system? Like, did he start that and make it a law, or was that put in later?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and we probably have better qualified people in the audience to answer. But there was something very important for the mothers. I mean, firstly, a lot of children were presented anonymously, so there was no way of knowing what their name was necessarily at the time. And the mothers were presenting the children to the hospital in the hope of a better life for their baby in the most appalling circumstances, where they were destitute, and the very fact that they had given birth to a child outside wedlock was a massive stigma and problem, that they were going to be destitute. So the promise of anonymity was made as a protective feature to the mothers, and the record books held detailed notes about what was known about the child, and certainly for a period of time, fabric tokens, so that the mother could possibly return back and have the identifying token. Oh, and David has very fortunately introduced Anne, who can pick up that very important point much more eloquently than me. This is Jeanne Kanyuk, former head of adoption at Coram. Yes.
I think that's just such an interesting question, because the same feelings and needs of children who aren't with their parents, you know, subsist over, you know, all these different ages, these different customs. I don't think it was the same motivation on the part of the Foundling Hospital. It was about protecting the stigma for these mothers, that these mothers, you know, their identity should be kept secret, you know, to enable them to lead a life, and hopefully the children would have their own lives. And nobody understood in those days that children need an identity, and that was very hard for them. I think the children's legislation today is, you know, for all sorts of other reasons, and it's gradually over the decades, it has opened up a lot. And there's much more understanding now that children need, if they're in the care system, it's really important that they have an understanding of why they're in the care system, how things have come about, what the plans are. And you know, there's a whole seminar last week at Coram about life story work, and the importance for young people in the care system to have an opportunity to really visit and understand their lives. So I think we are coming along, but there's always more that we need to be doing.
Thank you, Jeanne. And I just wanted to comment two things, because I believe we do have with us a friend and colleague from the United States, from Colonial Williamsburg, and there was a major exhibition by Coram of the record books at the Foundling Museum, and which then toured to Colonial Williamsburg in the United States, the governor of Virginia having been an early governor of the organization. And we're also joined today by, I know, a colleague from Shrewsbury, which was, the school was one of the regional Foundling hospitals as well. We've also got a colleague, well, a friend with us, Alison Pullin, who's left a comment for us. I don't know whether David might be able to introduce Alison, just to talk about the exploration that she has actually made of some personal history. And perhaps we'll see whether Alison is prepared to just say a little about that. Are you willing to just come in there, Alison?
Yes, I am. I'm happy to do that.
So please do let us know the journey that you were sharing on the Q&A there.
So we knew for many years that my great-great-grandfather was a foundling, but they believed he was a blue coat boy, and that sort of travelled through the family for many years. And it was my sister, who lives in Richmond in London, who decided to research further and went to the archives in, my husband knows, in the London archives anyway. And she went there and found all the details of his mother. So James Dalton, my great-great-grandfather, was the product of a very short-lived relationship. I don't think it's even a relationship, but between the housekeeper of a vicar and the visitor. And she got pregnant. And he was Italian, Giovanni Felice, and she actually called her son Giovanni Felice after her son. So Giovanni, the child, she knew she couldn't care for him on her own. And I've got all this information, but the vicar that was her employer wrote a letter to the hospital and said, "This woman is of good standing. Please, will you accept this child to be cared for by the Foundling Hospital?" And they did. And she sent money. She did send money. We've actually got, we've contacted family. She moved to America herself. It's Sarah Sanger, his mother. And she sent money over. She had more children, but never forgot about Giovanni. Giovanni married, and it's so he married, and his daughter Mary, she was Mary Half-Night Dalton. We don't know where the half-night comes from. We wonder if it was actually one of his carers. They were farmed out. Sounds awful, that, but they were
Fostered. They were
fostered, yeah. And we wondered if half-night was a name of one of his foster carers, because it's nowhere in our family. Dalton is obviously a given name, but he was Giovanni Felice. And my father, who passed away in 2019, looked very Italian. His cousins looked very Italian. It's in my DNA. I'm Italian. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And you know what I would say is that in every one of these stories, woven through history, is a legacy of Thomas Coram, who
Yes, absolutely.
In which the children could be looked after, and of course it wasn't perfect, and of course there were things that occurred that we wouldn't recognize today. But overall, you know, Thomas Coram created this change that made those lives possible. And there are two key areas that are coming up on the chat. Thank you, Alison. Two key areas that are coming up, which of course is crucially important to us. Thomas Coram was radical by the standards of the day. He was still a bloke in the 18th century. And of course, what we don't know, we don't know. But Thomas Coram was surprisingly at odds, perhaps, with slavery, and spoke out against it. Carol, can you address that legacy question for us, because it is so vital?
Yes, and it's certainly the case that this is inevitably the time we're talking about. The governors, most of the governors and supporters, everyone was involved in the slave trade if they were wealthy at that time. Thomas Coram doesn't seem to have those links. What we do know, and Gillian may know more about this too, which I'm sure she does, is that he seemed to be against the idea of the colony he was trying to establish in Georgia being a slave colony. And there's reference to him being, they agreed it wouldn't be, and reference to somebody who wrote about, well, he'll be very pleased to know that, as if he'd obviously argued forcefully for that. I've noticed on the chat as well about the connection between freed slaves who went to Nova Scotia and Coram. I don't know anything about that one. I know that one of our later governors, slightly after Thomas Coram, Jonas Hanway, was involved in the efforts to settle a colony in Sierra Leone. And I also know, it says also here in 1771, this is fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk about this. A freed slave who continued to live in London post-freedom was buried next to the Foundling Hospital. One of the things, we don't know what we don't know, as Carol says. And one of the things we do know is, though, that at this time, the black community in London, there were about 10,000 people. So there were a lot of black people in London. Some were slaves, some were ex-slaves. It was very mixed. There was a significant number of them actually lived in Holborn, really near to the Foundling Hospital. I mean, literally. They were known as the Blackbirds of St Giles. So we do know there was there, but it's the problem with this type of history is not well recorded. It's in fragments, and we try and piece those together. So
thank you, Carol. Anne, did you want to come in, and then Miriam?
I really just wanted to make a comment about Coram, whose motivation was so strong. I mean, 17 years is a long time to pursue and go on and keep on wanting to sort something out. And he was compassionate about children. I mean, that story about visiting the Foundling Hospital and bringing gingerbread for the children has been told many times. And I just think the fact that he was childless and a kind man who loved children, this was his way of contributing to children. And in a way, that's what remains in Coram, that it's, you know, it is a way of contributing to children.
Thank you. And Miriam, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that because he was protesting, obviously, to change things, I think that's really beautiful, and it makes me sad that now there's a kill the bill thing. They want to stop protesting and make that illegal when protesting has changed so many things over the years. That's ridiculous.
Going down in the road.
I'm sure, I think we may have been joined by Lord Russell of Liverpool, and I think he will have heard that. But all I would say is they may try, but they won't succeed. So protest will continue in its various ways, I'm sure. There is another point. Jeanne made the point that Coram was childless, as indeed was Hogarth.
And
there are
Handel.
Yes,
those three were childless.
Yes, and it's and Hogarth, I believe, also was an early foster carer.
Oh, he was, yes.
But there's several questions that have come up about the association with Handel. Now, I don't think Coram knew Handel, did he?
No. I don't think so. No, he didn't.
So Handel actually didn't get involved in the Foundling Hospital until, well, it was being constructed. And at that point, Thomas Coram was parting ways with the other governors, shall we put it that way. Do we know what led to the falling out? I mean, he was by then a very old man by the standards of the day, so that may have been a factor. But
let Gillian come in.
Yes, Julian.
Well, I think he thought that because there was he promoted a washerwoman to be the matron, and it was thought that she was perhaps his mistress, and Thomas Coram objected to that and wrote. You can't tell really because they were anonymous letters, so I don't know, but I think that was one of the reasons. And the governors then sort of closed ranks because they were grand and Coram wasn't. And in the end, the reason for his leaving the Coram Foundation was that something to do with the bricks, and they constructed he wanted some cheaper bricks, and he wanted more expensive bricks. I can't remember which way around it was, but anyhow, it was the bricks that enabled them to get rid of Coram as a governor. But lurking in the background was Coram accusing, I think, the then chairman of not behaving properly.
Well, there we go.
A little bit of scandal for you. And one other little bit, when we were on the tokens for the children brought in, there was a baby brought in, and he had rather splendid clothes and bonnet and whatever they were called, and his name was George and his surname was Hanover. So I thought, here's a lovely scandal, but the poor little infant died when he was only 6 months old, so I couldn't follow it up and find and
I
firewood.
think we conclude that Thomas Coram was an awful man for having opinions. He had opinions, he had principles, and he was going to fight for them. And so those became inconvenient at several points along the path, including over the bricks and over the standards of the day. And therefore, you know, as an old man, Thomas Coram wasn't really involved in the delivery of the charitable support to the children. He just created everything about it in one sense, and that legacy lives on. And as I said at the beginning, our current chairman, Sir David Bell, often says that Thomas Coram could walk into today and potentially feel at home. I wanted to just share with you, you may have seen it from an anonymous attendee today, and perhaps also especially for Jeanne. I hope you won't mind if I just read that, which was, I was adopted as a baby through a charity which subsequently merged with Coram. A visit to the Foundling Hospital with my Hetty feather reading daughter was very moving for me and significant in my personal journey towards tracing my birth parents, which I have now done successfully. I thank God for Thomas Coram and his successors. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I also wanted to share another small and wonderful thing that happened for us who work here at Coram today during lockdown, which was that a posy was left on our front steps. And it was left by the daughter of one of the children who had been supported by Coram on the day of her wedding in memory of her father. And that a pride of place in our archive alongside all the records of the past. So Handel, coming back to Handel, Handel was as a great composer able to give something very, very special. And he gave a gift of music and gave concerts, the first one being in the unfinished chapel because they had run out of money. He gave this concert. They messed up the tickets, so they had to run it twice on successive days because they had too many people to get in. It became a very fashionable ticket, and Handel gave those concerts every year for the last 9 years, I believe, of his life, raising a vast amount of money. So unsurprisingly, he was elected to be a governor pretty quickly after that occurrence. And in 1749, he also wrote the Foundling Hospital anthem, which begins with the words, "Blessed are they that considereth the poor." And we will hear a little more around that in a moment. So I'm just going to ask people before we close for this evening with whether there is a final remark from each of you. So I'm giving you just about 10 seconds to come up with your remark on what you feel most touches you about Thomas Coram, his life and his legacy. So perhaps we might start with Dame Gillian and then go to Carol Harris and Miriam and then Jeanne before we draw to a close. Gillian, what do you...
I'll go back to his childhood, and I think it's the fact that he never mentioned or said anything about the years when he was 11, the 5 years from 11 to 16 when he was going to sea. He never blamed his father for sending him, or never, although he did resent not having an education. But it must have been extremely hard for he was a young boy. And he never voiced any complaint at all.
No, thank you, Gillian. He'd lost his mother when he was 3, I believe.
Yes. And
yes, thank you. And Carol?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is just something I wanted to include because when we were talking about him as a man and his attitude to children, it's a lovely quote when he wrote about some people who he was seeing off to the colonies to settle, and they were stranded at Dover. So he went down on Christmas Day to see that they were all right. And he wrote afterwards, I carry the children a few apples and sometimes give them a few plums, a pound of Malaga raisins, which cost 3pence, fills them with above £5 worth of love for me. They shew it in a dawn of joy in their faces as soon as they see me coming. I think that's so much about his motivation. It's just a lovely letter.
And Miriam, what has touched you since you've come to know something of Thomas Coram?
Just his drive to do things for others, and his, like, he's not selfish, and like that whole story just made me really want to tear up, because I think he's a bit like me today. He knows what he wants, he goes for it, and no matter who stands in his way, he will keep fighting for it. And like someone said earlier, he had his opinions and he voiced what he was against, and people don't like that. And that's what I've noticed today. Like when I fight for things, people don't like that I raise my voice, like to get things clearer to people, and they don't like that. Yeah, I point out the faults and make people actually work. But yeah, I think that's amazing. He's amazing. He's a one-man army. He's great.
I think that's a new element of his eulogy.
I like that.
If there's one thing we could say, Miriam, he would be very proud of you. And Jeanne, last remark.
Yes. Well, I mentioned earlier him being childless, and you know that I thought was quite important in his compassion and urge to care for children. But of course, I've been reminded, listening to the other panelists, that he had such a deprived childhood himself. I mean, he wasn't a foundling. He knew who his family was, but he lost his mother. He was sent away at a very young age. He knew what it felt like to be without family. And I think that's actually quite an important thing to sort of bear in mind and sort of thinking about him, that it drove him, you know, it didn't make him a hard man, it made him a compassionate man and a very driven man.
Thank you, Jeanne. So David, as you prepare the film to close, for me, I think it's the fact that Thomas Coram wasn't afraid to do something new, even if it wasn't popular and fashionable, and to stick with it, however long it took. And that he believed in changing the world through good deeds, through actually making a difference, one life at a time, one step at a time, one cause at a time. And we all hope that we, in those respects, walk in his footsteps, and that he would be proud of the continuing legacy. And to celebrate that legacy, Thomas Coram's life and his legacy, we produced an illumination to mark the 275th anniversary. And we're going to play out tonight's event by showing you that and then say goodnight. But may I thank Jeanne for joining us, for Miriam for her reading, for Carol Harris and Dame Gillian, and particularly Dame Gillian for putting Coram on the map in your biography. So with our love to Thomas Coram on the day of his death, here is the closing film. And after that, we say good night.